I'm James Rosone.
And I'm Miranda Watson. We're the husband and wife writing team that created the military thriller Monroe Doctrine series and the military sci-fi series The Rise of the Republic.
We have some additional content we'd like to share with you guys today, and we hope you'll find it informative and entertaining. We're planning to create more videos similar to this in the future.
As always, please like, share, and subscribe. Now let's get started.
Chapter 11. California Dreaming. California, Fort Tejon State Historic Park. Staff Sergeant Mack jumped a bit when he heard the series of explosions. The morning had otherwise been silent, so it caught him off guard. The engineers were dropping both of the overpasses along the edges of the state park and Interstate 5. The entire 1st Marine Division had been beaten out of L.A. County. Following their tactical withdrawal, the division had been split up into two forces. Regimental Combat Team 5 was fighting the PLA as they moved up the coastal part of the state, doing what they could to slow or delay the enemy. RCT 7, on the other hand, had the task of trying to keep the PLA from breaking out of southeastern California into Nevada and northern Arizona. Mack's group, RCT 1, had the unenviable job of trying to keep the Chinese bottled up on this side of the valley before Bakersfield. If the Chinese broke through their lines here, they'd have a straight shot all the way up to Sacramento. The valley, of course, was the prized possession the Chinese were really after. It was the bread bowl of the entire state. It represented more agricultural output than nearly any region in China. Properly managed, the valley could meet a substantial portion of China's agricultural needs for generations to come. "You think dropping those bridges is going to slow them down?" asked Lieutenant Ambrose as he sat down next to Mack. The two of them could easily see the valley leading toward their positions from their perch. Staff Sergeant Mack shrugged. "Probably not, but it'll make people feel better. If you ask me, they'll just move infantry around the interstate and secure the area from the rear. Then they'll bring in construction equipment and move the rubble so their tanks and other vehicles can make it through." Ambrose snorted at the dreary assessment. "Aren't you full of optimism, Staff Sergeant?" he asked sarcastically. "I'm just being realistic, sir. It's what I'd do if I was in their shoes, and you would too." Mack paused for a minute, contemplating. "I know this is our last line in the sand, so to speak, but we don't have enough combat power to slow these guys down, sir. That National Guard brigade took a brutal mauling covering our retreat back to this position. Did you see how few of their vehicles and men made it back to our lines yesterday? They're spent, LT, just like most of RCT 1. "That may be so, Staff Sergeant, but we have to stay positive for the men," Ambrose countered. "They're going to need your help more than ever in the coming days. Things are going to get rough when they decide to push us off this perch." The LT waved his hand around at the land around them. "It'd be a lot easier if we had the state and the people on our side then. At least half the population out here hates our guts. Heck, we got shot at by a farmer the other day while out on patrol. We even yelled out that we were U.S. Marines. He just yelled for us to go back to Sax country and continued to shoot at us." With a look of concern on his face, the LT asked, "What did you guys do with the farmer?" "We shot him. He wouldn't stop shooting at us, and I wasn't about to lose any of my Marines to some turncoat. So we shot him dead. He didn't cause us any more problems after that." Mack replied angrily as he kicked some dirt with his boot. "We have to do our best to hold the state, or at least slow the Chinese, until reinforcements from other parts of the country can arrive and help us out," Ambrose insisted. The young Marine officer was having a hard time dealing with the civilians attacking them too. No one was happy about it, but those were the cards they'd been dealt. "I wonder how the rest of the division and 3rd MEF is doing along the coast," Mack said. "Part of me wishes we were the ones fighting along the coast. There's a lot more vegetation to hide and fight in than out here. We're pretty out in the open if you think about it." Lieutenant Ambrose let out a frustrated huff. I heard from the CO that half of 3rd MEF ended up getting diverted to Hawaii, so we don't even have most of their combat power here to help us like we were supposed to. What? When did that happen? I thought that was the whole reason we took the port of L.A. It was, Ambrose confirmed, but half of the division was sent to Hawaii to beef up their positions. They ended up having to recapture the Johnston Atoll, Wake Island, and Midway from the Chinese who had seized them all and were looking to add them to their unsinkable missile platforms in the Pacific. I heard we only have one carrier strike group in the Pacific, so there's some real concern the Chinese might capture Hawaii. The LT paused for a moment as he took a drag on his cigarette. As it is, Staff Sergeant, we can't really get a lot of supplies flown into the island from the States, and certainly there's no resupply coming from California or even Oregon. The entire Pacific and the West Coast is a bloody mess. As the two of them were talking, they heard the sound of aircraft flying overhead. Every now and then they'd hear an aerial battle taking place in the skies above them. Sometimes they'd even see a parachute descend to the ground below. If the pilot appeared to be reasonably close to their positions, they'd send a team out to go fetch them. Sometimes they'd end up returning with a Chinese prisoner. Other times they'd come back with an American Air Force or Marine pilot. Just as they were about to resume their conversation, the pitch of the noise coming from the fighters changed, and Mac realized whatever was above them, it was suddenly coming down to attack them. Staff Sergeant Mac looked up and pointed. "I think it's one of those flounders again," he exclaimed. "You know, the JH-7s they told us to be leery of." "Time to hit the deck," Lieutenant Ambrose yelled. The two of them dove for some cover and watched as the aircraft continued their attack runs. Ambrose grabbed his radio. "Incoming aircraft! Incoming aircraft! Take cover! Over!" he shouted, alerting the units below. A second later, they saw several missiles streak away from one of the aircraft as it turned hard and lit up its afterburners. Moments later, they heard several loud explosions, but couldn't quite see what had been destroyed. Then the planes circled back around. They appeared to be lining up for an attack run on the troops scattered about in the hills and woods of the state park. As the fighter bombers got closer to their positions, they cut loose a swarm of rockets into the valley and hills where the Marines had taken refuge. Then the warplanes pulled up hard and sped away. 2 Stinger missiles shot up through the underbrush and immediately gave chase to the retreating fighters. The Chinese planes spat out flares to distract the heat-seeking warheads. One of the Stingers went for the flares, while the other one detonated just behind the engines of one of the Chinese planes. "I think one of the engines blew up," Sergeant Mac told Ambrose. "Check out all that flame and smoke." The pilot ejected as his plane lost control. The aircraft blew up shortly after that. The pilot's parachute filled with air, and he began his slow descent to the earth below. For the next 30 minutes, Chinese warplanes showed up in larger numbers as they sought to attack the Marine position. However, shortly after the Chinese aircraft began arriving in larger groups, U.S. fighters joined the fray. While the Knights of the Air fought it out, the king of battle made his presence known. A rolling crescendo of artillery fire rained down on the valley and the ridge lines where the Marines held their positions. Explosion after explosion rocked the area, sending debris and shrapnel in all directions. At one point, the artillery barrage on the state park had gotten so bad, Staff Sergeant Mac wasn't sure there would be anyone left alive. They must have moved an entire brigade's worth of artillery, he thought. This is insane. The attack lasted for nearly 2 hours. Once it had finally let up, Mac stood up and looked around for his Marines. Fortunately, everyone had dug a fighting hole for this very reason. The one thing they'd been forced to learn rapidly when fighting the Chinese was that they loved artillery. They'd hammer an area for an hour or 3 or 4, and then launch their ground assault. Staff Sergeant Mac knew their strategy. He was concerned that the Chinese had been using the hours-long barrage to move their infantry into place. Sure enough, within the first few minutes of the barrage finally letting up, he heard the unmistakable shriek of a PLA officer's whistle. "Everyone up!" Mac screamed to his squad. "Man the trench line, now!" The other squad leaders began yelling the same thing at their men. In an effort not to give away their positions, the Marines had dug several trench lines just below the top of the ridge. They'd also built a secondary line that was directly on top of the ridge in case they needed to fall back. On the reverse slope, the Marines had dug another set of positions where they'd ridden out the bombardments. The logic was that if they gave the enemy something to shoot at, they'd focus their attention there and not where the Marines were actually hiding. As Mac reached the top of the ridge and looked down at their two defense lines, he smiled. Those positions looked like a moonscape. The PLA had pounded them relentlessly, but no one was there. Their strategy had worked. Despite hours of artillery attacks, very few of their men had been injured or killed. Seeing his pre-designated position, Mac jumped into one of the 6-man trenches. His M240 gunner soon joined him. Mac had also swapped out his M16A2 for one of the newer M27 IARs. This significantly upgraded his squad's firepower and gave them a real boost. While everyone was filtering into their positions, bullets started to crack and snap all around them. Looking down the ridge, Mac saw a veritable wall of humanity attempting to race up to them. It was almost like a tsunami wave steadily rising towards them, threatening to overwhelm and envelop them. Only this wave was not made of water, but of angry Chinese soldiers hell-bent on killing them. The sight sent a chill down his spine. Turning his emotions off, Mac fell back into his training, just as he had done so many times before. "Open fire! Give 'em hell, men!" Mac screamed. He raised his M27 to his shoulder and began firing single-shot rounds at the incoming horde as accurately as possible. The enemy was 300 meters away, but they were steadily gaining ground. Several of the M240 gunners opened fire, sending sheets of hot lead down the ridge, cutting down huge swaths of enemy soldiers. The 2 other M27 gunners also joined the fray, and then the rest of the company began to place well-aimed shots at the enemy. At this range, killing the enemy required a lot more skill and technique than what the Chinese soldiers were showing. The PLA soldiers were just aiming their QBZ-95s up the ridge and firing a few shots indiscriminately, in between running forward and pausing long enough to catch their breath. Every now and then, Mac would spot a handful of soldiers sporting the newer LR-17 battle rifles, which were very much like the Army's M4, tricked out with AGOC sights, forward handlebars, and other convenient attachments that made killing one's enemy easier. Mac and his squad had only been in the trench line firing for maybe 2 or 3 minutes when he heard the familiar sound of mortars flying over their heads towards the enemy. The mortar rounds landed directly on the ranks of the charging infantry, throwing metal fragments everywhere. Sergeant Mac allowed himself to breathe for just a moment. The mortars were effectively blunting the enemy's relentless assault of the hill. He flipped the unlock lever for his machine gunner, who swiftly changed out the barrel before it overheated. Unfortunately, the reprieve was short-lived. While the mortars were decimating the enemy ranks, 6 Chinese C-10 attack helicopters fired a barrage of anti-material rockets right at the Marine positions. Then the choppers raked their lines with their chin-mounted 14.5mm Gatling guns. "Take those damn choppers out!" someone yelled to the Stinger operators. Seconds later, a pair of Stingers flew out towards the killing machines. The appearance of the missiles caused the C-10s to break off their attack run and take evasive maneuvers. Fortunately for the Marines, both missiles found their marks, and 2 of the helicopters crashed to the ground in a fiery mess. An American F-15E swooped in low over the Marine positions and fired off 4 air-to-air missiles, which summarily obliterated the remaining enemy helicopters. When the F-15E banked hard to the left to get back over friendly lines and gain more altitude, dozens of strings of enemy tracer rounds flew out from every which direction after the American warplane. While the Eagle pilot managed to evade what looked like a carpet of anti-aircraft fire, a missile streaked down from higher altitude and blew the plane apart. Mac didn't see a parachute, so he figured both pilots must have been killed. They saved our lives, and it cost them theirs, he thought. He shook his shoulders out and returned his attention to what was directly in front of him. The enemy had recovered from the mortar attack and was once again charging up toward them. They were now just under 150 meters away. Mac aimed his M27 at a small cluster of enemy soldiers and squeezed the trigger once, hitting the man he was aiming at in his right shoulder. Adjusting his aim slightly to the left, Mac fired another round, hitting a second guy. Then he dropped below the lip of the trench to reload his rifle. A string of rounds hit the sandbags right where he had just been. One of the guys in his squad that was standing next to him grunted as he clutched his chest and then fell backward into the trench. Mac saw that he had been hit just above his body armor. Blood was pulsing between the man's fingers as he tried to slow the bleeding. Then he coughed. Blood spewed out of his mouth. Sergeant Mac knew immediately that his squad mate was dying. He'd been hit in the lungs, and they were already filling with blood. The young man didn't have much time, maybe a minute or so, before he'd be gone. Mac saw fear in the young man's eyes. He'd probably put two and two together just like Mac had done. He knew he was going to die. Despite all of the shooting, screaming, and death going on around them, Mac placed his rifle against the side of the trench wall and reached for the man's free hand. Looking him in the eye, he said, "Don't be afraid, Pinkman. I'm here with you. You aren't alone. You did a great job. You did everything you could to help your brothers, and I couldn't be prouder of you than I am right now." Tears streamed down the young man's face. Then he let go of the bullet wound and reached into his cargo pocket. Blood was still leaking out of the wound, but it wasn't gushing like it was before. His body was starting to fail, but he held out long enough to place a bloody envelope into Mac's hand. With his dying breath, he said, "Give this to my parents. I want them to know that I'm no longer angry at them, that I still love them." The man's grip suddenly loosened, and his hand fell to the ground. His head drooped down to his chest, and he was gone. Wiping away his own tears, Mac shoved the bloodied letter into his pocket and grabbed his rifle. It was as if the world around him had come to a complete halt as he spent the last minute of Pinkman's life with him, holding him and reassuring him that he was loved and his brothers were proud of him. A second later, though, the sounds of war rushed right back into his head and reverberated throughout his body. Each explosion felt like a body blow as the sound waves hammered his senses. Looking around him, Mac could see that maybe a quarter of their platoon was dead, while at least another quarter had been wounded in some fashion, but was continuing to fight. They all knew if the enemy broke through their positions, they'd be killed for sure, and the rest of the valley would be at the mercy of this marauding army invading their country. Gripping his rifle handle tight, Mac looked down at the charging soldiers. They were now within 100 meters. They were getting close enough that Mac could see the raw emotions of fear, anger, hatred, and determination written on their faces. Mac flicked the selector switch on his M27 from semi to full auto and squeezed off controlled bursts of automatic fire into their ranks. He knew this would burn through his ammo, but he had to slow the Chinese down and do what he could to stop them from overrunning his position. Soon after, Sergeant Mac dropped his second magazine of the battle. He slapped the next one in place and hit the bolt release. He changed positions slightly and proceeded to fire another set of controlled bursts into the enemy ranks. As soon as he'd cut down 3 or 4 enemy soldiers, the gap would fill up with more soldiers charging from the next row below. It was pure murder, what Mac and his platoon were doing to these men, but if they didn't keep killing them, they'd be wiped out themselves. Over the constant roar of machine guns and rifles firing at each other, Mac heard an FA-18 Super Hornet flying low along the valley. As the aircraft flew over the enemy positions, a series of cluster munitions released across their positions. Intermixed with the cluster bombs were a handful of Mk-82 Snake-Eye bombs. Between the cluster munitions and the 500-pound dumb bombs, the enemy was severely hammered. The attack started to falter and lose steam, but the enemy officers continued to blow their whistles, urging their soldiers onward. Just then, nearly a dozen smoke rounds exploded over the tops of the enemy positions. The smoke rounds threw dozens of little smoke canisters down into the PLA soldiers' positions, which immediately began to blot out the Marines' ability to see them. Oh, this isn't good, Mac realized. If he and his men couldn't see the Chinese soldiers, they'd be able to charge right up to their positions. Then, dozens of smoke rounds dispersed right over the Marine positions. At this point, Mac knew he and the rest of the Marines were in trouble. The enemy was going to smoke the entire area out and force everyone to fight practically at point-blank range, which would favor the attackers, not the defenders. Mac heard their platoon leader, Lieutenant Ray Ambrose, yell out, "Everyone, fall back to your secondary positions!" Sergeant Mac grunted. He couldn't see squat. Maybe moving to a new position might help. Before leaving, Mac grabbed Pinkman's remaining rifle magazines. He knew he'd need them. Then he reached over to set off the series of claymores they still had out there. The first claymore he tried to detonate didn't go off. Damn it. The artillery must have severed the detonator cord. He grabbed for the second clicker and depressed it several times in rapid succession, just like he had done many times before. This one blew up immediately. Mac couldn't see if he had hit anything, but he wasn't waiting around to find out either. He repeated the process with the remaining two clickers and then ran to their fallback positions. While they waited for the next wave, the M240 gunners swapped out their barrels and attached additional belts to the ones they already had in the weapons. The Marines knew they wouldn't have time to do these tasks when the enemy emerged from the smoke screen. By the time the Chinese reached their first defensive line, it would place the enemy soldiers no more than 50 meters from them. The one blessing Sergeant Mac could perceive, however, was a shift in the wind. It was now blowing over the ridgetop and moving down the slope, pushing the smoke screen further down into the valley and exposing the PLA infantrymen a lot earlier. The Marines wasted no time in taking advantage of the change in the situation. As soon as the Chinese soldiers emerged from the smoke, the Marines resumed firing, killing as many of the enemy soldiers as they could as they continued their relentless charge up the hill. "Staff Sergeant Mac!" shouted Lieutenant Ambrose. Mac spotted the LT waving for him. He jumped up and ran over to him. "What do you need, LT?" he asked as he plopped down next to the lieutenant. "Gunny Crockett is dead. Staff Sergeant Matz was also killed. You're my new platoon sergeant. We have to hold this position until our rides show up." Staff Sergeant Mac felt his jaw hang open from surprise. "What do you mean, until our rides show up? Are we leaving?" Ambrose nodded, his disapproval evident. "Yeah. The entire RCT is going to try and pull back to Camp Nelson in the Mountain Home State Forest. No idea what the plan is once we get there, but we're supposed to get ready to move in 20 mics." Mac fired off a couple of short bursts at an attacking group of enemy soldiers, then turned back to the LT. "They do realize we're in the process of trying not to get overrun right now, don't they?" he asked. "The enemy was already at their first line of defense." "I know, Staff Sergeant. The captain is over there trying to repulse this attack as well. We have some fast movers inbound. When they plaster the enemy positions, that's when we're supposed to beat feet down to our rides." He pointed further down the road behind them, where there were several long lines of LAVs, JLTVs, and a few amphibs. "Just make sure the rest of the platoon is ready to move. I'm going to go tell 3rd and 4th Squad. I need you to make sure 1st and 2nd Squads are ready." The LT didn't wait for any further comments. Despite incoming enemy fire, he dashed off to 3rd and 4th Squad's positions so he could tell them to be ready to move. Mac made his own way back down the line and passed the information along to his Marines, firing a burst from his M27 every time he stopped moving. The enemy was now less than 40 meters from their positions. At that point, Mac yelled, "Start blowing the claymores!" Seconds later, one by one exploded all along the line. Swaths of enemy soldiers turned into a bright red mist of pulverized flesh from the barrage of tiny steel ball bearings. The anti-personnel mines acted like giant scythes, cutting down nearly everything in their paths for a solid 10 to 20 meters. Further back, they were still hitting soldiers, the small metal balls that would often break bones or blow tiny holes through their bodies. The claymores were brutal, but incredibly effective for the type of fighting they were doing. 4 FA-18 Super Hornets swooped over their positions, releasing more cluster munitions and 500-pound bombs on the enemy charging their positions. When the fighters made a second pass, they used their cannons to strafe the Chinese soldiers that were practically right on top of the Marines. "First and 2nd Squad, fall back!" Sergeant Mac yelled. It was controlled chaos. The Marines stopped firing at the enemy, and under the cover of the air attack, they ran like hell down the ridge to get in the waiting vehicles. The gunners on top of the vehicles and the LAV turrets were all aimed up at the Marines who were running toward them. They were ready to cover their retreat should the enemy manage to crest the ridge. Mac made sure to pull up the rear of the position. He wanted to make sure none of their guys got left behind. He helped a couple of the wounded guys maneuver down the trail and got them seated inside the vehicles. As soon as the last Marine was loaded up, the vehicles peeled out. They headed down the road that would lead them through a series of ridges in the park to the other side of Interstate 5, where the engineers hadn't destroyed or blocked the road yet. It was a race against time to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the enemy they were retreating from. Once inside the relative safety of the vehicles, a couple of the soldiers broke down and shed a few tears for their dead comrades. No one said a thing about them crying. The guys just needed to let those emotions out so they could go back to killing the enemy when the time came. As they moved back onto the interstate and picked up speed, Mac ordered, "Start reloading your magazines. There's a stash of ammo in this LAV." Corporal Phillips dropped a few F-bombs. "I can't believe we're retreating again, Staff Sergeant. We've been leaving one position after another now for nearly 2 months. I'm tired of retreating." Many of the others nodded their heads in agreement. The troops were getting frustrated by defeat after defeat. It was demoralizing to be constantly losing friends fighting on a hill, only to have to fall back and give that hill up to the enemy. Although Mac agreed with their frustrations, he decided to try and lighten the mood a bit and remind them all of the bigger picture. "Corporal, first of all, we are not retreating. Don't ever let anyone tell you that, and don't you ever believe it. We're merely fighting in the opposite direction and making sure the enemy doesn't capture the land to our rear." A handful of Marines laughed. It was kind of an old cliché, but it got the message across. "Second, we are bloodying them immensely with each of these battles we fight. Did you not see how the entire ground before us was covered like fall leaves with their dead? The enemy can't continue to sustain casualties like that. Besides, our next location we're going to secure is 100 times better than what we just left." Corporal Phillips smiled as he shook his head. "Okay, Captain America, where are we headed to now?" he asked. Mac grinned. He was glad to see Phillips snap out of the doom and gloom mood he'd just been in. "We're headed to the Mountain Home State Forest," he explained. "It's a densely packed, wooded forest with some good hills and some low-lying mountain ranges. It's the type of covered terrain that will allow us to thoroughly destroy these Chinese soldiers." The rest of the guys in the vehicle nodded and smiled. They clearly liked the idea of that. Mac knew they'd just suffered a tough loss and that they'd all lost some friends. But they still had a war to fight, and there'd be plenty more battles that needed to be fought. He had to get their minds back in the game, or they could end up falling apart as a platoon. For the next 3 hours, the remnants of RCT-1 drove like madmen trying to get away from the Chinese force. They were fortunate in that a squadron of Air Force F-35s had been assigned to provide them with air cover. The Lightnings did a hell of a job keeping the Chinese Air Force off their backs. When the Marines reached Bakersfield, it was almost like they'd reached a welcome home party. Well-wishers gathered outside, waving flags and displaying signs that thanked the Marines for liberating them. Sadly, the Marine vehicles couldn't stop. The residents' initial cheerful reaction soon soured when they noticed the dilapidated states of the vehicles and saw that they were only passing through. They had to know that the men weren't there to liberate them from the California state government and that they were fleeing from the Chinese army. As they continued along the road, Mac and his men saw several citizens follow behind them in their own vehicles. The people must have figured they'd have a better chance where the Marines were than as sitting ducks waiting in their homes. Long Beach, California, Bluff Park. Xander and Trojan, both a part of SEAL Team 7, had been hiding out in one of Trojan's family homes in Long Beach. They kept observing and sending a microburst transmission of their data every 8 hours. Their platoon had been told to disperse and disappear within the population of LA and the surrounding area and await further orders just before the Marines pulled out. Some of the platoons, like theirs, had been broken down into small observation teams. Their goal was to provide a variety of surveillance and intelligence of what was going on in the city and the ports back to SOCOM and the Pentagon. Each day, they'd send up 2 high-altitude signals intelligence drones, which were roughly 12 inches in diameter and hard to detect unless someone knew to look for them. Once the drones reached about 1,500 feet in the air, a small set of wings would unfold and allow the devices to largely glide on the wind. Interwoven on the wings were a series of solar panels that allowed the batteries to continue to charge, which kept the drones flying for a solid 8 to 12 hours. When the batteries were getting low, the wings would retract and the drones would descend to the rooftop, where Xander or Trojan would retrieve them so they could recharge them in the house. Mounted on the bottom of each drone was a small electronic device that was specifically tuned to listen to and copy radio traffic on the bands the PLA were using. When one of the drones needed to land due to a low battery, Xander or Trojan would download the copied radio traffic and include it in their next burst transmission. They'd wipe the memory card clean and then load it back into the drone before they launched it again later. This allowed them to continually scoop up the radio traffic in the occupied zones for further analysis by the NSA, DIA, and CIA. "I still can't believe your family owns this place," Xander commented. It was probably the 100th time he'd made the same remark since they'd set up shop here more than a month ago. "You keep saying that. Why are you so surprised?" asked Trojan, the lieutenant in charge of this particular intelligence operation. "I don't know. I grew up in a poor neighborhood in Chicago. I used to walk along Michigan Avenue as a kid, looking at all the fancy apartments and condos along Lake Michigan. I mean, I knew there were rich neighborhoods and people lived in those fancy places, but I never knew anyone who lived there. I guess I was surprised when you said we could bunk out in one of your family's homes, that's all." Trojan sighed. "And this is why I never talked about my background or where my family lives," he thought. "My dad has always been smart with money," Trojan explained. "He knew the market was going to crash in 2006, so he started liquidating all of his rental properties. He made a mint doing it. Then he dumped everything into gold when it was still cheap. When the market tanked, he tripled his money with the gold he'd bought. Then in 2013, when the market started to stabilize, He sold all his gold and dumped it all back into real estate again. I saw him snatching up properties left and right for half of what they'd sold for just 5 years earlier. By the time I graduated college in 2014, the family business owned 14 houses in Long Beach. When I graduated SEAL training, my dad sold 2 of his properties to me dirt cheap so I could build my own equity in them. That way I'd have something to fall back on when I got out of the SEALs. I kept them rented, and here we are, staying in my house that I rented to my aunt. It's the perfect cover, Xander. Tell you what, Trojan, when this war is over with, you need to sit down and show me how to get into this business, said Xander. Clearly it's paying off for you. I've spent 18 years in the Navy. I've never been married, and I save like a pack rat. At this point, I've got about $500,000 in my investment account. Maybe you can help me figure out the best way how to use it to set myself up for life after the SEALs. Trojan nodded. I like that idea. We'll definitely do it. When this war is over, the whole of San Diego and LA is going to be ripe for buying and flipping. We'll make a fortune if we time it right. Trojan returned his gaze to the spotting scope they had set up in one of the bedrooms. It provided them with an exceptional view of the port and all the ships docked there. Spying something unusual, he tried to angle the spotting scope to get a better look, but he just couldn't get the right angle. "Look at that, Xander," he remarked. "That must be the 4th freighter I've seen pull up to the cruise terminal this week. Something seems odd about it. You never see them offload any troops or equipment, so what are they doing?" Xander walked up to the scope and looked at the terminal for himself. From their vantage point, they couldn't really see what was going on. The angle was wrong, and they couldn't see what all was going on in the nearby parking lot with the floating museum in their way. Xander shrugged. "I don't know what's going on at the cruise terminal, sir. What I do know is there's a long gravy train of transports and supply ships offloading at the port. That's what we need to keep our eye on." "Yeah, but don't you think we should turn one of the surveillance drones to head over in that direction and at least see what they're doing?" Trojan asked. "I mean, you've heard the rumors about people turning up missing all over LA. This could have something to do with it." Xander snorted. "Look, I get it. I know you want to believe your nephew and all, but we can't risk losing one of our surveillance drones to check out a rumor," he insisted. "I mean, at the end of the day, sir, you're in charge, but my advice is we don't risk one of our few surveillance drones by attracting any unwanted attention. We need to keep feeding the guys at SOCOM and the Pentagon with a steady report of what's being offloaded and the radio traffic. If we attract the PLA's attention because they spot a surveillance drone, they might trace it back to us, and then the jig is up. We've been lucky they haven't already found us. I don't know if we want to push the envelope any further than we already have." Trojan nodded grudgingly, but he still couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about those transports. Later that evening, after dark, Trojan opened a small case that held some of their micro-drones. These little drones were the size of his hand. They didn't have a long battery life, but they were outfitted with night vision and thermal sensors that could allow them to see what was going on no matter what the conditions were like outside. Walking into the room, Xander saw him looking longingly at the little drones. "You want to use one of them to go check it out, don't you?" he asked. Trojan nodded but didn't say anything. Xander shrugged. "Well, these are more of a throwaway drone, and you'll probably have a better chance of seeing what's going on over there now than if we try to do this during the day. Let me get the laptop up and running so we can record what we're seeing." A smile crept across Trojan's face. He hurried to set up one of the drones and synced it with the laptop so they could see what it saw. They walked out to the patio and he set it on the ground. Then he put on the virtual reality goggles he'd need to fly the drone and grabbed the hand controller. Once the system check had been completed, he initiated flight. After the drone had reached about 300 feet, Trojan aimed it toward the cruise ship terminal and sped off to go investigate. As he neared the terminal, he moved the drone up to around 800 feet. They could finally see past the transport ship and into the nearby parking lot. There were dozens upon dozens of buses. Some were leaving the parking lot, while many others appeared to have just arrived. Using the zoom on the camera, Trojan saw a lot of people getting off the buses. Still not sure exactly what was going on, he lowered the drone 500 feet. "Oh my God," Xander remarked. "Why the hell are they loading a bunch of women into the transport ship?" "There have to be some men in the group," Trojan responded. But a moment later, he hadn't seen any either. "Xander, both of these transport ships are being loaded up with nothing but women." He could feel his mouth hanging open at the horror of it. "What are they doing with all of them?" asked Xander, concern in his voice. "I don't know," Trojan replied. He turned the drone around to help provide them with a clearer picture of the cruise terminal and the ships in port. He made sure to get a good look at the ship number and name for the analyst they'd be sending this data back to. With the VR headset still on, Trojan asked, "Don't these micro-drones have a tracking device on them?" Yeah," said Xander. "Why are you asking?" "I'm looking at the battery life, and right now we're showing roughly 21%. I'm not sure it'll make it back home before it cuts out, but I could try and find a nice spot to set it down on one of these transports. If it has a tracking device, we can have the NSA track the ship and find out where it's heading." "You know, if you find a nice little spot for it to land, you can deploy the little solar panel wings. They're slow as hell when charging, but if it's going across the Pacific, it'll have plenty of time to recharge. When it arrives in China, the NSA could probably remote access it and see where they are taking the women. It might help shed some light on what's going on," Xander explained. Trojan smiled at the idea and looked for a nice, quiet little spot where he could set the drone down. He found a small ledge near the top of one of the smokestacks. It had just enough of a lip that it looked like it would keep the drone from getting swept off the ship by the wind or a rainstorm during the journey across the ocean. So he opted to set it down there. With only 6% left on the battery life, Trojan extended the little rechargeable solar wings and shut the drone down. It would now trickle charge for a few weeks as it journeyed to wherever it was going. Later that evening, they both wrote up what they'd seen and included the file of the video they'd taken. They provided the serial number of the drone along with its unit identifier number. That would allow the NSA or CIA to remotely access it once it reached China, assuming they had a satellite nearby that hadn't been shot down that could take control of the drone. With their work for the day done, they prepared the information packet to be sent off along with the other data they had collected during the day. In 20 minutes, it would all be transmitted back to SOCOM and the Pentagon for further analysis. Chapter 12. Texas Discovery. Ciudad Juarez, Mexico. Diaz lay on the ground under a desert camouflage IR-resistant netting, looking through his spotting scope. Under the cover of darkness, they'd found this spot, just far enough away from people not to be spotted, but just close enough to provide them a good view of what the locals were telling them was a mass grave site. He and Perez had dug a shallow fighting position and then set up their camouflage over top of it to help ward off the heat and provide them with enough room to move a bit underneath and not get spotted. It had taken them nearly 4 days to reach this position undetected. They had been fortunate to have found a local that hated the Chinese as much as the Americans and had been willing to show them where to look. Perez and Diaz were members of the 7th Special Forces Group out of Eglin Air Force Base. They were both Latino Americans and native speakers of Spanish, which meant they had an easier time infiltrating into Mexico and being passed off as locals instead of Americans. Their ODA team had been tasked with crossing the Mexican side of the border and investigating some claims being made by American refugees that had escaped from the Chinese-occupied zones. There had been rumors of mass killings. Thousands of women were supposedly disappearing. No one really knew what was going on, and satellite intelligence and even drone surveillance over the battlefield raging across the southern border was sketchy at best. A pair of human eyes needed to investigate it further. By the middle of the first day of them observing the abandoned stretch of desert, all they had seen was what appeared to be a random bulldozer and 2 large Caterpillar front-end loaders. Then, around 1600 hours, a PLA Mengshi, the Chinese version of the American Humvee, showed up. 4 soldiers got out. 2 of the soldiers started marking out something on the ground, while what appeared to be an officer pointed at a few areas. Each time he pointed somewhere new, the soldiers ran to where he was pointing and sprayed something on the ground. Then they moved to the next area and repeated the process. This went on for maybe 30 minutes before one of the soldiers climbed into the bulldozer and started up the metal beast. As the diesel engine got warmed up, it belched thick black smoke into the air. The soldier driving the vehicle maneuvered it over to one of the marks where they'd sprayed the ground. He dropped the front blade and then began to dig a long trench. He made 3 passes over the same stretch of dirt, creating a 4 or 5 foot deep trench with large mounds of dirt on either end. Once the trench had been dug, 2 other PLA soldiers hopped into large front-end loaders and started digging the ditch a little deeper in the center portion. It took the guys who were working the construction equipment maybe an hour to get whatever it was they were doing completed. Then the officer appeared to place a call, which didn't last long, and he and the 3 other soldiers made their way back to the Mengshi and began eating some food. "What do you think they're doing?" Perez asked quizzically. "Not sure yet," said Diaz. "But if you look further behind the trench they just made, there appear to be several long mounds of dirt, almost like they've done this before. The mounds don't stick up much above the ground, but you can see they're still fresh, like they've just been created in the past few days." Perez grunted. "If I didn't know any better, I'd say these are mass grave sites, kind of like what we've seen down in Colombia, Iraq, or Syria." Diaz shivered at the thought. If they are, then it'd confirm some of the stories those refugees have been telling. When the soldiers appeared to be done eating, Diaz turned to Perez. "I think you should set up the transmitter," he said in a low voice. "We won't have a lot of time once whoever it is that's coming shows up." Nodding, Perez pulled out a small directional communications antenna and angled it towards the Gulf of Mexico. The Air Force had a couple of UAVs that'd be operating in the area to relay whatever they transmitted and make sure it was passed along to SOCOM. While Perez was setting up his part of the operation, Diaz grabbed a SOCOM version of the Swarovski 20 60x80 spotting scope, which had a specially designed video recorder and transmitter fitted to the back of it. After setting the $5,000 optical masterpiece up next to their other spotting scope, Diaz snapped his fingers for Perez to toss him the coax cable for the transmitter. Diaz attached it to a USB coax converter and placed the USB device into the small Toughbook laptop he'd set up next to the scope. Then he attached another USB cord from the Toughbook to the spotting scope and started running through a quick systems check. Next, Diaz grabbed the small roll-out solar pack and tossed it to Perez. Barely sticking his hand outside their IR protective netting, Perez unrolled the camouflage solar panels and then attached the power cable from the panel back to the computer. This DARPA-designed rollable solar panel was just large enough to power a Toughbook and their directional communication antenna. It was also painted in a color pattern which would make it very hard to spot with the naked eye and impossible to see from the sky. For their operations, it was absolutely critical that the sun not glint off it, giving away their position. Next, Perez pulled out a small Israeli-made surveillance drone, about 1 foot in diameter. It could reach a maximum altitude of about 3,000 feet. If it wasn't moving aggressively, it could stay aloft for upwards of 2 hours, providing nearly constant, real-time video of whatever they placed the drone over. The video feed could either be transmitted back to them or be stored on a memory card for later download. Once the drone was ready, Perez placed it just outside their protective netting and grabbed the VR headset and handset. All he had to do at this point was turn it on and start transmitting the video. Diaz made sure the secured Wi-Fi was in stealth mode and synced to the drone. This would allow them to see the video feed was working correctly before they launched it. Diaz set up the computer screen so that the drone feed would display on half of the screen, while the view from the spotting scope would be on the other side. At the bottom, he had the communication control panel opened so he could monitor the communication status of the data. "I'm sending the code to the Navy to get their relay system set up," Perez announced. It was time to get ready for whatever was coming next. Nearly an hour went by before they saw their first sign of activity. It was now 1900 hours, and they probably had about another hour or so of sunlight. Perez suddenly pointed down the road. There were dozens of trucks and buses heading towards them. "I think this is it, what we've been sent out here to see." He sent a text message via their Thuraya phone to their HQ, letting them know they would start transmitting data soon. Up in the air, 2 Air Force RQ-170 Sentinel UAVs waited to receive their data. One loitered 100 miles away, and the other was flying 800 miles away. These stealth surveillance UAVs would hover above the battle space and act like radio receivers, grabbing data and then parsing that data out into small data packets that would be transmitted in microbursts. The Sentinels were an excellent tool because they could transmit data while drastically reducing the electronic signature. The Air Force couldn't use the drone for constant real-time surveillance, or its stealth features wouldn't work, but for short, one-off missions like this, they were the perfect tool, despite the risk that they might get detected. When the trucks and buses stopped near the Mengshi, Perez quietly commented, "Hey, check out all the passengers. They're all slumped over, like they fell asleep during the drive or something." "Get the drone up. We need to start getting more angles to this," Diaz whispered. "Try to make sure the drone has a good view of what's going on over that trench." Perez nodded and began to fly the drone. Diaz activated the video recorder on the spotting scope and recorded what he could. He started his video feed by showing how many vehicles were there. Then he zoomed in on one of the truck bays with the bodies all slouching on each other. Using the zoom magnification, he was able to make out that the passengers in the back of the truck appeared to be older. He didn't spot many people under the age of 70. There were a few younger-looking folks, but not many. Moving the scope to one of the trucks a bunch of soldiers were near, Diaz saw the 2 large Caterpillar front-end loaders line up at the end of the truck. The equipment drivers then raised the front bucket up a little bit to place them more level with the back of the truck. When the first front-end loader moved up to the edge of the truck, a couple of soldiers in the back bay grabbed some of the slouching bodies and started throwing them into the large bucket of the front-end loader. "Perez, those slouching people weren't asleep," Diaz moaned. "That wasn't a sedative they were using either. They're all dead." Instinctively, Diaz grabbed his pen and started making a tick mark for each person he saw being dumped into the front bucket of the loader. Each time the bucket appeared full, which was usually when 8 or 9 bodies had been tossed into it, the loader would back up and head towards the trench while the other loader took its place. Using the spotting scope to follow the loader, Diaz made sure they got a good image of it dropping bodies into the trench. He followed the loader back to the truck, where the process was repeated. By the time the loader made its third trip, the sun had gone down. Some of the soldiers had set up portable lights near the truck that was being emptied and had placed a couple along the trench to help light it up. The whole process went on for probably 6 hours as they emptied all the trucks and buses of their human cargo. When all of the vehicles were empty, they left as a group to return to where they'd come from. Once the buses and trucks were gone, the soldiers who were driving the loaders and the bulldozer began to cover up all the bodies with the dirt piles they had created. It took them close to 60 minutes to fill in the mass grave and level out the dirt. When they were done, a small mound remained, just like the ones behind it. Finally, the soldiers then parked the construction equipment nearby, hopped back into their Manxie truck, and headed into town. A couple of hours into the whole ordeal, Perez had to bring their drone back to base. He immediately swapped out the spent battery with a new one, but held off on launching it until after the enemy soldiers had left the area. They had seen what they needed to see. Now that they were certain each of those mounds represented a mass grave, all that remained was to count how many of them were already out there. 20 minutes after the soldiers had left, they sent their drone back up to investigate. They spent the next 30 minutes counting and investigating every possible mound they thought might have been a mass grave. In short order, they'd counted 47 of them. Turning to look at his partner, Perez asked, "Roughly how many people would you say were buried in each mound?" Diaz looked down at his pad of paper and then did some quick math. There were around 500 bodies in the mound we just saw them cover up. If all of those mounds hold roughly the same number of dead, then that'd add up to be something like 23,000 bodies. Perez shook his head. "We should snatch one of these guys and try to find out how these people died. They were clearly dead when they showed up. Are they being executed and then brought out here, or what's the deal?" Diaz nodded. "I agree. Let me see if HQ will let us do that, or what they want us to do next. Otherwise, I don't think we need to stay out here, now that we've seen what we needed to." Brownwood, Texas. Sergeant Matt Higgins of the 2nd Armored Brigade Combat Team looked at the Sergeant First Class Velcro insignia he was holding in his hand. He knew he should be elated that he was being promoted 2 full grades. Instead, he just felt sorrow and anger. He hadn't earned this rank. It wasn't being given to him because he was qualified to hold it or because he was a model soldier. Hell, 2 weeks before the war they gave me an Article 15, he remembered. He'd been demoted from staff sergeant to sergeant after he'd gotten tangled up in a bar fight at a strip club with some guys from his platoon and had unknowingly struck an officer who'd gotten into a heated argument with one of the soldiers in his squad. Then the war had broken out, and it had been non-stop fighting ever since. Looking down at the new rank insignia again, he knew why he'd been given this promotion. He was one of the few remaining sergeants left alive in his platoon. They'd already lost 2 lieutenants since the fighting had started, as well as a company CO. The unit was running on fumes, and it didn't look like they were going to slow down any time soon. For the time being, their company had taken over a small-budget inn not far from US 67. It was on one of the main roads that connected San Angelo to Dallas-Fort Worth to the west, and Junction City to the south along Interstate 10. It wasn't a very large city, but it did straddle a couple of key 4-lane highways that led to the Dallas area. Most of the brigade was scattered around the area. The infantry units acted as the stationary fixed force, and the armor and cav units were the mobile force that would shift around, depending on where the enemy was hitting the line the hardest. It was a tough position for the infantry battalions to be in, since they would largely be on their own with only helicopters and minimal air support until a battalion of tanks could show up. At best, they had their strikers, JLTVs, and armored cars for immediate support, but that was about it. Higgins ripped the sergeant patch off the front of his uniform and placed the new rank in its place. He grabbed his patrol hat and took the old rank off. Next, he pulled the pocket sewing kit out of his ruck to stitch his new one in place. He knew the job he'd done wouldn't pass a close inspection, but it would get the job done for the time being. He placed the patrol cap back in his right trouser leg, got up and walked over to check on his guys. After exiting his hotel room, Higgins walked around to the swimming pool. The location of the pool, in the middle of the hotel, was convenient in that it let his soldiers get a little wild and cut loose a bit without making fools of themselves in front of the members of the general public who might happen to wander by. While this place wasn't a permanent lodging solution, it was working out well for their company. As he neared the pool, Higgins heard the voices of men and what sounded like a number of women laughing and goofing off. When he rounded the corner, he saw a sight that brought a big smile to his face. Dozens of women wearing bikinis and attractive one-piece swimsuits all around the pool. Some of them were doing chicken fights, sitting on top of his soldiers' shoulders and trying to see who could knock the other girl off their perch first. Others were floating in the water, chatting with his men, while others lounged around in the chairs nearby. Higgins hadn't seen a scantily dressed woman since that evening at the strip club around 6 months ago. He really wanted to take a minute and chat one of them up, but then he was drawn back down to harsh reality by the sight of his company commander waving to get his attention. He slumped his shoulders and sighed audibly, but he made his way over to see the captain. Here we go again, he thought. As Higgins walked toward his CO, Captain Peevler, he saw him talking with a new officer he hadn't met yet. Peevler smiled at him. "Ah, there you are, Sergeant Higgins," he said happily. "The lieutenant here is from division. He said he has some new replacements for us. I'd like you to go greet them and figure out how many should go to each platoon. Top's still at battalion, trying to look into getting us some additional supplies, and he has Sergeant Morris with him. Sergeant Riker is checking on our guys at the hospital, so I'm afraid you're the senior guy for the time being." He pulled a paper out of his pocket and handed it to Higgins. "Top put this together last night when we were told we were getting replacements. It says how many guys each platoon is short. Do your best to get the platoons leveled out if you can." Higgins nodded. "Oh, before you go, at 1700 hours we're going to have a company formation. I've got a number of promotions we need to hand down, and we've got a lot of awards to give." "Awards?" Higgins asked drearily. Captain Peevler held his hands up in mock surrender. "I know, Higgins. Now that we aren't in constant combat, the freaking battalion and brigade CO are all over me to get our paperwork sorted and up to date. Starting tomorrow, I'm going to need you to work with Top and figure out what NCOers need to get done and what career counseling statements are due." Sergeant Higgins shook his head in disgust. Damn Army and their paperwork. Peevler laughed. "You should try being an officer. It's far worse on our end," he teased. "Okay, take the lieutenant here and go round back and get them sorted. We've got evening formation in 4 hours. Plenty of time for these guys to get moved into whatever platoon they're assigned to." Higgins nodded. "Not a problem, sir." He turned to face the lieutenant. "Sir, if you could drive the vehicle around to the rear of the hotel, I'll take it from there." The lieutenant smiled and walked off to retrieve his vehicle. As Sergeant Higgins walked toward the rear parking lot, he saw all of the soldiers hanging around by the pool again. He envied the position of being a lower sergeant when he could just chill in the pool with a girl and let the higher-ups deal with all this crap. Now he was the higher-up, and he was stuck with running the platoon on his own, at least until a new officer was assigned. As he walked around the corner to the rear of the hotel, Higgins wondered how many replacements they were getting, and if they were going to be National Guardsmen or raw troops fresh from basic training. He almost stopped dead in his tracks when he saw 2 Greyhound buses. Soldiers started getting out of the buses and falling into a formation. The lieutenant spotted him and walked towards him. "Sergeant, this is the roster of the replacements being assigned to your company. I'll have them get their gear off the buses, and we'll be on our way. I have a few more trips I need to make to Fort Worth to pick up more guys." Before the LT could leave, Higgins asked, "Are we actually starting to get a lot of replacements?" The lieutenant smiled. "Yes. All those draftees and volunteers are finally starting to graduate from training. When I left the airport a few hours ago, there had to be 3,000 or 4,000 new replacements waiting to be sent to their units. It's quite the gaggle." With that, the LT yelled for everyone to get their gear off the bus. Higgins watched the gaggle of raw, green soldiers for a moment. He didn't know if he should laugh or cry at the sight of them. They desperately needed replacements, but the thought of so many brand-new soldiers joining them also concerned him. 5 minutes later, the buses left, and Higgins was left staring at 52 new, wild-eyed replacements. While they were standing in formation in front of him, he pulled out the paper the captain had handed him and started figuring out how many replacements they actually needed. As it turned out, they needed 46 replacements, but they'd been given 52. Higgins smiled as he realized they'd have a few extra for each platoon. He looked the new guys up and down before he addressed them. "Listen up. I'm Sergeant First Class Higgins. Welcome to the 1st Battalion, 6th Infantry Regiment. I've been with this unit for 6 years. It's a good unit with solid people in it." He paused for a second before he added, "In the last 4 months, we fought inside Mexico just after we nuked the Chinese. Then we fought a brutal battle along the Texas-New Mexico border that turned into a bloody street fight in El Paso for 3 weeks. Next, we battled through a series of delaying actions for another 2 months across much of Texas. In that time, our company suffered 36 KIAs and another 22 wounded. Now, I'm not going to sugarcoat things. We're in the fight of our lives against these Chinese bastards. They don't take prisoners, and neither do we. If they catch you, they will torture and kill you, so don't surrender. You fight to the bitter end with your squad and platoon mates. You understand?" A resounding, "Yes, Sergeant," echoed from the new soldiers, though many of them suddenly looked nervous. Sergeant Higgins cleared his throat. "I'm going to call out some names. When I do, I want you guys to stand over near that area. That first group will be going to 1st Platoon. When I call out the next group, y'all will be going to 2nd Platoon." He explained that they'd stay in their groups until he got their platoon sergeants to show them to their rooms. Then it would be the platoon sergeants that would go over further information on what would come next and what to expect. The next 15 minutes went by expediently as he broke them all down into 4 groups. Then Higgins told them to sit tight while he rounded up their platoon sergeants. He pounded on Sergeant Simmons' door for a couple of minutes. "What the hell, Simmons?" he called, trying not to disrupt the entire floor of the hotel, but hoping to get the sergeant's attention. When Simmons finally opened the door, he was sporting a pair of gym shorts and nothing else. Higgins saw a naked girl lying in the bed, covering herself with the sheets. Simmons didn't say a word, but shot him a very irritated look. Sergeant Higgins smiled and tried to keep himself from laughing. "You've got 5 minutes, he announced. "I've got the replacements for your platoon, and I need you to get them squared away." Simmons nodded. "I'll be out there in 5 minutes, he replied gratefully. Once Higgins had the 4 senior sergeants for each platoon in the parking lot, he told them about the evening formation and made sure they knew they had to have their guys ready. They'd be cut loose after the formation to enjoy the rest of the evening. By and large, they had only been having one formation a day, usually around 1700 hours, just to make sure everyone was still alive. The rest of the time, they either slept most of the day or got thoroughly drunk at the bar attached to the motel. When 1700 hours rolled around, Higgins was standing in front of his platoon at attention as their captain called out the various soldiers being promoted, beginning with the E3s and going through E6s. It took a little while to get through all the promotions, but Higgins realized that it was important for the men to get them. The increase in pay and rank was helpful for the ones that were married, which was close to half the company. Next came the awards. They started with the guys getting Army Commendation Medals with V devices, denoting it as a Valor Award. That included everyone in the company who wasn't getting awarded a higher level medal. Next came the Purple Hearts. Again, nearly all of the original guys in the company received one of these medals for one injury or another. Then came Bronze Stars with V device. As he stood through the awards, Higgins was actually getting kind of angry. Maybe I ticked off one of our COs or top when they were writing these things up, he thought. Aside from the 2 Purple Hearts he'd gotten, his name hadn't been called. Then the captain called Higgins forward, along with 3 other soldiers. He presented them with silver stars. Higgins was a bit taken aback. As the captain read off the citation, Higgins thought back to that horrible day when he had lost his entire fire team in that battle at the elementary school near El Paso. It was the single worst day of his life. His platoon had fought like hell and had nearly been wiped out in the process. Yet somehow he'd survived. An hour later, Higgins was sitting at the hibachi grill of the Sawa Japanese steakhouse next to the hotel. He still had his Purple Hearts and Silver Star medal attached to his uniform, and he wore them proudly. This might be the last time I get to wear them if the war continues to go the way it's been going, he thought. He wasn't sure any of them would survive more than a month or 2 at the current rate. Higgins spotted a gorgeous-looking woman who had to be in her late 20s or early 30s. That probably made her about 5 to 8 years older than him, but he didn't care. She was looking hot, and he was horny as hell. He motioned for her to take a seat next to him, and she did. The 2 of them talked for an hour over dinner and drinks. He probably had 4 or 5 shots of sake, and she had a couple herself. The next thing he knew, they were having a wild romp in his room. When he woke up the next day, she was still there, lying naked in the bed next to him. He got up and used the bathroom and brushed his teeth. She did the same and used the mouthwash he left out for her. They went a couple more rounds that morning before she said her goodbyes. She made sure to give him her cell number and address in case he wanted to call her or write. "If you have any family or anywhere else to go, you should get out of town," he warned. She seemed concerned by his comment, but nodded at the advice. They agreed to try and see each other again, but he told her when the Chinese did eventually arrive, she needed to get out of Texas. He hated telling her to leave because he knew he wouldn't be able to see her again, but he didn't want anything to happen to her either. "If I leave, I'll write you and give you my new address," she said with a wink. They shared a long, passionate kiss before she finally left. Feeling like $1 million, Higgins spent the rest of the day just chilling next to the pool. He felt invigorated and ready for whatever was going to come next. San Antonio, Texas. JBSA Kelly Field Annex. Igor Radchenko stood up and stretched his legs now that the plane had stopped moving. The aircraft had finally landed and come to a halt next to the main terminal on what had been the U.S. Air Force's primary training facility. Now it was the central logistical hub for the PLA Air Force and Army, along with the flood of military contractors that were now arriving by the hundreds per day. When the door to the aircraft opened, Igor immediately felt the humid heat of June in Texas smack him in the face. He breathed in deep and savored the rich smells of the Texas air, intermixed with the scent of aviation jet fuel. Smiling, he led the way off the plane, followed by roughly 220 of his men. They were the first members of the Wagner Group to arrive on American soil. Looking off into the distance, Igor saw rows and rows of planes being offloaded. Hundreds, maybe thousands of Chinese soldiers quickly fell into formations in front of the aircraft as they awaited their next set of orders. Beneath the planes, baggage handling equipment and K-loaders unloaded the soldiers' weapons and gear from below. But then Igor saw something that caused him to pause. He pulled out a pair of pocket binoculars out of his breast pocket and surveyed the gaggle of people who were waiting to board one of the many aircraft the soldiers had just exited. Why would they be loading the planes full of women? He wondered. It seemed a bit odd. A Chinese military walked up to him with his hand extended. "I'm Major General Shu. You are Igor Radchenko?" he asked. Igor nodded and shook the man's hand. "Yes, I am," he replied. "Thank you for meeting me here. Where would you like my men to set up our headquarters?" General Shu smiled. "We've assigned 2 of the buildings that used to house the Air Force trainees to your group, and they can accommodate up to 600 people comfortably. As requested, we acquired 80 Chevy Suburbans along with 45 Chevy quad-cab pickup trucks. They are parked in front of your buildings, ready for use." Igor grunted and nodded his approval. A week before leaving Russia, the head of the Wagner Group had put in the request for the vehicles. "Were your men able to find the police Bearcat vehicles we had requested?" Igor asked. "Also, do you have the 50 linguists on hand to help my men interact with yours?" "Yes. The police SWAT vehicles are parked near your buildings," General Shu confirmed. "I've assigned 50 of my officers who speak fluent Russian and English to your group. They have the necessary gear with them, so your forces can communicate with our army groups." "Excellent, General Shu. Thank you for making this a smooth transition. Most of my men will arrive today and tomorrow. We are going to spend a couple of weeks familiarizing ourselves with the city of San Antonio, and then we'll spend some time on the rifle ranges before we set out to join your forces. Do you have a particular area where you are wanting to deploy my men?" "Yes. I have a colonel assigned to be the liaison between my office and yours. He'll go over where we're going to assign you." The two talked for a few more minutes as the plane finished emptying. Then a slew of buses started to show up, ready to take them over to their new living quarters and base of operation. When their bus pulled up to the massive 4-block building, Igor's Chinese LNO pointed out the 2 blocks of the building that were assigned to the Wagner Group. There were rows and rows of vehicles parked in the parade field next to the buildings. They looked to be either brand new from a local car dealership or newly acquired vehicles from the local population. In either case, they appeared to be in perfect working order, which was a good thing. As the buses pulled up to the building, everyone started to get out. They grabbed their gear, moved into the buildings, and immediately went about assigning rooms to everyone. A handful of the men did a quick once-over of the vehicles, turning them on so they could check their fuel gauges and make sure everything was working. As any problems were detected, they wrote down the issues so they could be addressed. After each inspection, Igor's men painted the letters WG and a vehicle number on the front and rear bumpers of the vehicles. That way they'd be able to identify them within the group. Next, they used a placard to paint WG on the front doors, so their Chinese counterparts would easily be able to identify them as friendlies. The next 10 days went by in a blur. They broke themselves down into small 50-man units and spent several days driving around the various neighborhoods and parts of the city, as well as doing some foot patrols through the area. They needed to familiarize themselves with their new surroundings and get used to being inside an American city. They also spent several hours a day at the various rifle ranges on the base. They redid their qualifications on their rifles, pistols, and any other weapons they'd brought with them. They also made sure everyone was familiar with how to use a myriad of American rifles and pistols, since there might come a time when they'd have to use them. Once Igor had determined they were operationally ready, they'd start infiltrating the front lines just ahead of the Chinese forces to cause as much havoc as possible. The PLA was gearing up for another major offensive to finish capturing the state of Texas. Once they captured Houston and Dallas, they'd be able to cripple the American defense aerospace industry and put a major dent in their petroleum manufacturing capability. 2 more weeks, then we'll be unleashed on the Americans, Igor thought with a devilish smile. Chapter 13. No Good Decisions. Washington, D.C., White House. The president sat fuming in his chair, almost numbed by what he'd just watched. General Marcus, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, was furious as well, and so were all of the other generals and senior advisors in the room. The National Security Advisor, Robert Gray, spoke up first. "This needs to be made public," he demanded. "The rest of the country needs to see this. They need to know what these bastards are doing to our country. We also need the rest of the world to see this and finally get off the sidelines." The Secretary of State quickly chimed in. "I agree. This just might finally be the spark we need on our side to convince our hesitant allies that now is the time to join us, to come to our aid. Furthermore, I think this just might be the nail in the coffin to get the Indians to finally act and open up a second front against the Chinese." Admiral Smith shook his head. "The Indians won't open a second front. Not now that our last carrier in the Pacific has been destroyed. The Chinese have fully mobilized their population for all-out war against us. The last human intelligence report we got from the Japanese 3 days ago said the PLA has gone from 118 divisions to nearly 200 divisions over the last 6 months. Their militia force of nearly 3 million members has also been fully mobilized. Worse, the Japanese said the Chinese have already sent nearly 200,000 People's Armed Police Force to administer the occupied zones. They're even creating massive penal battalions from their prisons, promising freedom after they complete their military service in the Americas." CIA Director Ryerson asked, "Have you seen some of the recruiting videos they are creating to get people to join their army? All they run is footage of the dead and dying from our bombing raid on Beijing at the outset of the war, and the devastation caused by destroying the Three Gorges Dam. I'd have to say that's pretty damn effective if you ask me." The president shook his head in anger and disgust. "This can't be happening," he said in a voice just above a whisper. "Someone tell me this is some sort of sick joke, that what we just saw isn't happening to American citizens." He searched the faces of his advisors for any glint of hope that this was all just some elaborate prank. Vice President Powers let some air blow out past his lips. "I wish this was some sort of bad dream, Mr. President," he said glumly. "I wish I'd been able to do more during the first week of the war when you were trapped in the tunnel." Turning to look at his vice president, Sachs replied, "You did everything you could, Luke. Don't beat yourself up over it. It's not your fault. I'm just frustrated with this situation, and I feel powerless to stop it. I can't believe we're seeing American citizens being buried in mass graves in Mexico." He turned to Secretary Cagle. "What do the Mexicans have to say for themselves?" he demanded. She sat a little more erect in her chair. "Sadly, not much," she replied. "I think the government may be having some buyer's remorse for allowing the Chinese to set up shop in their country, but there's not much they can do now." Secretary Cagle shuffled her papers. On a good note, the Colombians are mobilizing their country for war. They're going to attempt to attack Panama and seize it back from the Chinese. Chile, Brazil, and Argentina will join the fight as well. None of them like what the Chinese have been doing. Heck, even though the Brazilians are still upset with us about the whole Lamy incident, they're saying they want to get involved in removing the Chinese from the hemisphere. Once they heard Lamy's public testimony and his private interrogation, they were appalled at what he had done. They said he'd brought real shame to their country. Not all has been forgiven between them and our military, but they do agree that China is a threat to the region that needs to be dealt with. President Sachs nodded in approval. "That is good news. But make sure they're coordinating everything with General Marcus and Admiral Smith here. This needs to be a well-planned joint operation if it's going to succeed. I don't think our Navy is quite ready to support an operation like this yet, but that will hopefully change soon." Turning to look at Admiral Smith, the President asked, "Speaking of the Navy, what the hell happened in Hawaii? How did we lose another carrier?" Smith sighed and turned red with embarrassment. "It was 2 carriers, Mr. President," he admitted bashfully. Sachs slammed his hand down on the table and let loose a string of obscenities before he calmed down enough to say, "Explain to us what happened." Admiral Smith took a gulp of the glass of water in front of him. "During the first day of the war, sir, the Chinese used their new stealth bombers on us," he began. "That's what hit us at Raven Rock, the H-20. We weren't sure how many of them they had, although we knew we successfully destroyed 2 of them, one during the first day of the war and a second one a few days later." Smith tugged at the collar of his shirt as if it were suddenly choking him. "As you know, we've had the Stennis and Vinson in the repair yard at Pearl since the first few weeks of the war. We were going to move them to Bremerton in Washington to finish their repairs. We held off on doing that because we didn't have a real way of protecting them during the transit. Nearly all of the ships in their previous strike groups had been redeployed elsewhere to support the Marines retaking the Johnston Atoll, Midway, and Wake Island. That meant the Hawaiian area was only being protected by the Roosevelt and her strike group." The President cut him off. "Enough with the lead-up. What the hell happened? How did the Chinese manage to get enough forces close enough to Hawaii to hit us like this?" Admiral Smith sighed. "We believe the Chinese seizure of Wake and Midway Islands was a diversion, an attempt to draw more of our naval forces away from Hawaii to support the Marines landing on the island. When they saw our forces hit those 2 islands, they launched their real attack on Hawaii. With much of the island's electronics still fried, they were able to deliver a knockout punch to our forces there. Last night, a group of H-20 stealth bombers paid Pearl and the surrounding area a visit. The Stennis was hit with a couple of 2,000-pounders that wrecked her flight deck again and caused considerable damage to the hangar decks below. She's still afloat and the fires are finally out, but she'll need months of repair before she'll be back in the fight. The Vincent took 12 hits across her flight deck and control tower. She's a burning mess right now. Even if we can get the fires under control, we have no idea how bad the rest of the damage is yet. She isn't taking on water, but she's completely ablaze, so it may be only a matter of time. As to the Roosevelt, this was a much more complex and organized attack. The Chinese Navy engaged the strike group with 2 of their own carrier ships, along with 4 of their merchant raider ships. They threw a missile swarm at the strike group. They also had a handful of submarines join the fray. It was a huge, multi-dimensional attack, the first real naval multi-force-style attack we've seen the Chinese carry out. While all that was going on, some of their H-20s got within range to drop a dozen J-dams, which hit the carrier. She ended up going under about 6 hours ago. Admiral Smith held a hand up to forestall the likely barrage of questions. I'd like everyone to know we also sunk one of 3 Chinese carriers and half of her escort ships. It wasn't a completely one-sided affair. We hurt their navy bad. General Vance Pruitt blurted out several F-bombs very loudly before popping all of his knuckles. How are we supposed to keep the damn Chinese from capturing half the country if we can't stem the flood of reinforcements they are getting from the mainland? He shouted. Project Odin is going to put an end to that, Admiral Smith insisted. Yeah, if it ever gets completed, Pruitt replied hotly. By the time it does, if it stays on schedule, the Chinese will have moved more than 5 million, maybe even 10 million soldiers to our country. I don't know that we'll be able to defeat them when that happens. Plus, we're still putting down domestic uprisings all over the country. Then he let loose a torrent of obscenities. The president held a hand up to stop the bickering. Hey, Vance, let's try to tamp down the cursing. I'm the only one allowed to blow my lid in the meeting, he said jokingly, trying to lighten the mood. Sighing, General Pruitt nodded. You're right, Mr. President. Sorry, Admiral. I know your guys are doing their best. I think we're all just a bit frustrated with these setbacks. Agreed. But let's not go after each other, all right? Asked General Marcus. The Attorney General, who had been invited to this meeting because of the new video SOCOM had acquired, had been silently sitting there watching everything play out. Patty Hogan from DHS had done the same. In the break in the arguments, the president suddenly noticed them sitting there with shocked expressions on their faces. They didn't normally attend war briefings, so their knowledge of the broader military situation was not as deep as many would have thought. The AG raised his hand like a college student, waiting to ask the professor a question. Go ahead, Malcolm, said Sachs. What do you have for us? AG Malcolm Wright leaned forward in his chair. First, I want to agree with Mr. Gray about releasing this information to the public. Second, I wanted to address the domestic issue General Pruitt brought up, which is a very valid argument. The president nodded for him to continue. Okay, I'll start with the video first. Right now, the wounds of the UN occupation and the discovery of this grand foreign conspiracy to rip our country apart is still fresh in people's minds. Both sides feel betrayed, and no one really knows who to trust. The only thing that has held us together up to this point was the UN invasion and then this brutal nuclear attack and invasion by the Chinese. I think we need to use that to our advantage. We need to show the American people that not only did this global cabal conspire to steal our election and divide us, the Chinese are now using our weakened position to commit mass murder of our people. We can use this video to rally the country to defeat this dastardly enemy. We have to convince the people in the states that are currently still in open rebellion against us that we are not the enemy, that the Chinese army, which was part of the UN force, is not on their way to liberate them from us. And what do we do if they won't come around? Asked General Pruitt angrily. Do we just pull our forces out of those states and let the Chinese have their way with them? I'm not a military man, so I can't speak to that, Wright countered. But I think it's safe to say that our forces in California are getting wiped out. Between the non-support we're getting from the state and the fact that we can't effectively reinforce those units, we may need to abandon the state for the time being until we can make a concerted effort to retake the state. General Marcus shook his head. We can't just give up California, he insisted, especially if we know what the Chinese are doing to people in the occupied zones. If we can't keep our forces in California supplied and able to fight, we won't have a choice, Pruitt argued. I've shared with you the reports of some of our Marines and soldiers having to fight the California Civil Defense Force militias in addition to the Chinese. He glared at General Marcus. Sachs understood the animosity. Between the Army and Marines, the two services had been getting hammered with losses. They had constantly been on defense since the war started some 6 months ago. "We're not giving up California," the president announced. He pointedly looked at General Pruitt. "That's final," he stated flatly. Sachs then turned to look at Patty. "What's going on with your security force?" he asked. "Are they having any luck at restoring order across the country?" "In some states, yes, but not out west," she replied, shaking her head. "We're sending a flood of people out to Washington State to get it back under control, but it's slow going. We've also been sending a huge number of our people to the East Coast to help free up the military so they can be sent south. We're still cranking out 6,000 recruits a week, but it'll be another 5 or 6 months before we have the numbers to handle all the current needs." "Okay, Patty. Keep us apprised of the situation. You know, I was skeptical about your security force in the beginning, but I think they're proving to be exactly what we needed." Sachs turned back to his Army and Marine leaders. "How's the training program going? Are we getting enough people run through basic and boot camp to keep up with our losses and expand the size of the military?" The Commandant of the Marine Corps, General Miles Harris, replied first. "Yes and no. With the loss of our West Coast facilities, we've effectively lost half of our training capacity. However, we've tripled the size of our facility at Parris Island, and we've also opened up new training bases at Quantico and Camp Lejeune. We shortened their training to just the initial 13 weeks of boot camp. Presently, half of the recruits are sent directly to the lines units that need replacements. The other half of the recruits are forming up the nucleus of the new divisions we're reactivating. As each new division becomes fully staffed, we move them to front lines. For the Marines, we're fighting primarily out west in California and the Caribbean." "Thanks for the update, General Harris," Sachs said with a nod. He turned to the Army chief. "Same question for you, General Pruitt. How are things coming along for the Army?" "Like the Marines, we've shortened some of our advanced initial training. 2/3 of the new recruits are going directly to the infantry. For soldiers going into the infantry, we've simply expanded their basic combat training from 10 weeks to 13. Right now, we're using Fort Jackson and Camp Shelby for all non-infantry training. Nearly every Army base in the South has been turned into a basic training base. We're graduating approximately 20,000 new recruits a week now that we're fully up and running. Roughly 1/3 of them will go on for a condensed advanced training. Like the Marines, we're sending half of the newly graduated recruits directly to units at the front that need them. The rest of the recruits are being thrown in with the new soldiers as they form up a lot of newly reconstituted divisions. We've reactivated the old 5th Corps and 6th Corps. At current pace, they'll be ready to fight as independent Corps elements in a couple of months." "What about the PMCs?" asked the president. "I've been getting a lot of calls about integrating them in with our forces. Thoughts?" A couple of generals looked uncomfortably at each other, and an awkward silence followed. While many of their soldiers would go on to work for PMCs after getting out, Sachs had heard concerns from them in the past about how to integrate the private military contractors into the main fighting. Patty Hogan from DHS raised her hand. Sachs nodded for her to speak. "Mr. President, while integrating them into the military may be problematic, I'd like to incorporate as many of them as possible into my security force. They bring a wealth of experience that our present security force doesn't have. If you'll let me, I'll work with the DOJ to figure out how best to integrate them into our organization. This could be the force we need to get some of these western states back under control." The president smiled and said, "Get it going, Patty." The meeting went on for another hour as the various individuals got the president up to speed on their particular areas. While there were still disagreements about how to proceed, the thing that everyone agreed on was that they needed to get the country solely focused on defeating the Chinese, or they were toast.
Thank you for watching our video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you'll never miss another video.
In the meantime, we have plenty of reading material to keep you busy. You can find it all on our website, frontlinepublishinginc.com.